اوكي. طيب، مساء الخير. مساء الخير للجميع. Good evening for everyone, to everyone. Yanis, we're very honored to be speaking with you today. You are well, a renowned economist, of course, the former Greek Minister of Finance and co-founder of Democracy in Europe Movement 2025. So yes, you're welcome. Welcome with this for this conversation, and I just want to reiterate our sincere gratitude for your presence here and for your time. I know that you have only about an hour today, so we'll try to make the best of your time as well. Um, uh, and just a note that we have translation interpretation from and to Arabic and English. فهنا يعني توجد ترجمة للغة العربية. بإمكانكم استخدام أو يعني اختيار اللغة العربية من خلال إشارة العالم أدناه، تغيير اللغة لمن يرغب. So Jens, I was again welcome, and today we hope to be able to unpack with you a subject that continues to shape the lives of millions and millions around the world. As you know, that today's talk is titled "Perpetual Wars: The Rise, Decline of Imperialism." And it is difficult to imagine a more urgent moment for this discussion. This morning, we woke up to news of a 2-week ceasefire. Whether it's temporary or not, we'll have to see, between the United States and Iran, with both sides claiming victory. While the terms of the agreement remain unclear, it's certain that Israeli aggression in Lebanon, and as we Palestinians know all too well, Israel's ongoing genocide on Palestine continues unabated. This genocidal violence, of course, in the Gaza Strip and the continued annexation of the West Bank proceeds in full force. Although the ceasefire has only just been announced, we also know that the lead up to it involved 40 days of brutal violence, consisting of attacks by Israel and the United States on Iran, accompanied by deeply aggressive and colonial rhetoric threatening the destruction of Iran's civilization, as Trump had threatened numerous times. Now, this war, of course, is not new. Israel and the United States have previously targeted Iran in June of last year. At the same time, Israel's genocidal war on Gaza, carried out with the support of the United States and its allies, continues. Across this region, war and instability persist, whether it be in Yemen, Lebanon, Libya, Iraq, Sudan, and Syria. These all remain as sites of ongoing violence. However, this reality is not confined to our region alone, even if it can be argued that this part of the world perhaps has borne a disproportionate share of imperial violence in recent times, whether through direct military intervention or indirect forms of domination. We might also recall here the US intervention in Venezuela, for example, Trump's rhetoric and declaration of armed conflict against who he may refer to as drug cartels. All of this, of course, as we continue to witness states of perpetual war in Russia, Ukraine, and other parts of the world. So, Yanis, given this kind of brief introduction, I would like us to begin by discussing this current moment and the US imperialism and, of course, its allies, including the Zionist regime's constant need for war making, whether it is in Iran, Palestine, Lebanon, or other locations. So, the question I want to ask as we begin, how can we situate imperialism within this state of perpetual wars? And what does this permanent state of war tell us about the nature of imperial forces today? Again, Yanis, thank you very much. And just a note that we'll have hopefully time for questions later on. Thanks again, once again, Yanis.
To thank you for organizing this. Speaking to friends say that if this were 1938, the Trump. that he's trying to find an off-ramp, because he could have easily have gone, that would simply have created, more deaths, more maimings, as himself. So, enriched uranium is out of the picture, is gone. Be sort of liberated, in inverted commas, from Iranian influence, to be charging tolls for. So, here it is, folks. We have a very clear defeat of the hegemon by a middle power, Iran. The clasps of this anytime soon, but it is a and that is bringing me back to the topic of mutation, who's over a planet. Those who are in its surroundings. So that I just for the record to share with you my assessment for the world economy. They are going to be very severe. Anybody? Europe. For a very long time. But that's also another discussion because it's a bit off topic. That brings me to the second plank, the agricultural lands, expropriation. So if you want to understand the Lisbon and so on, of expropriating. A great transformation we have a new form. Imperialism is not so much about looting, it always involved looting, about battle. Feudalism to capitalism. What we saw was that primarily the repeats, the purpose of which replacement international trade routes, where certain commodities sail from Southampton, full of wool, to India, exchange the wool that the Indians didn't have with silk that the British didn't have, then travel on to Japan and trade some of the silk for high quality steel that the Japanese were renowned for, and then come back to Southampton, having left with a pile of smelly wool, with lots of silk and lots of very lucrative and very desirable, Japanese swords and tools and stuff. You can imagine the arbitrage. You can imagine the profit rates of those captains. So once wool became the fundamental export of the British Islands at the time, the lords found it very profitable to replace the peasants with sheep in order to have a lot more wool to sell. And for the first time, the moment you replace the peasants with sheep, and you have a commodity which is produced on your land that fetches its price in the international markets and not in the local markets, and that's wool. Suddenly, you can measure the amount of wool and therefore gold that every acre of your land can produce every year. Suddenly, every acre of your land acquired a monetary value, something that it didn't have. You see, there was no real estate under feudalism. People didn't buy and sell their land. Either they inherited it, if they were lucky, or they lived on it and worked on it, and they would never be able to buy it or own it if they were peasants. But therefore, there was no market for land. Therefore, there was no price mechanism to determine the price of land. But with the emergence of commodification of wool, what happened was the land was commodified. And immediately, labor was commodified, because when the peasants were thrown off their land to be replaced by sheep, suddenly you had the creation of the first working class. Not that it was the first class of people working, the peasants were working very hard before that. But this is the first class of workers that have to sell their labor. Because under feudalism, they didn't sell their labor. They produced wheat or corn, and the landlord simply extracted a certain percentage of it. That was a ground rent. But that wasn't a labor market. There was no wage. So labor and land was not commodified prior to the transition from feudalism to capitalism. So this great transformation that begins with the advances in navigation, with shipbuilding, with the emergence of certain commodities like spices, like wool, like silk, like metal products, like salt in some regions, as international commodities, commodities that were internationally traded, and therefore their price was determined internationally, that brought about the commodification of labor and land, the commodification of capital goods, that is, produced means of production, tools like plows and later steam engines. So if you throw into the mix, into the cauldron together, commodified labor, commodified raw materials, and you add money that is being accumulated from this international trade route, and the steam engine, you get the first factory. And that is the Industrial Revolution. Now, the problem with the Industrial Revolution was that, on the one hand, it unleashed gigantic powers of production. The division of labor, as described by Adam Smith in his Wealth of Nations in the first chapter, the division of labor, together with the mechanization of production, with a steam engine, together with a high concentration, the economies of scale. You put in one large factory, machines, and lots of people that have no access to land, and therefore they have no alternative but to work for peanuts. You have the great paradox of capitalism, which is a fantastic capacity to produce stuff, huge quantities that are being produced per worker compared to previous modes of production. But at the same time, the whole business model is predicated on extracting surplus value from the workers, out of which surplus value the entrepreneurs, the bosses, paid the banker for the money that was advanced to create this, to build this factory. That was interest. Out of this surplus value, they paid the landlord for the land that they were occupying, and what was left was profits. However, as the logic of the system is predicated on maximizing profits and therefore extracting the maximal surplus value from workers, this is the conundrum, this is the paradox of capitalism. Huge productive capacities, societies could produce a lot more stuff than what they could consume. Because workers, by definition, had low wages, so that surplus value could be maximized. So the workers, who are the vast majority of the population, could not afford to purchase all the goods that were being churned out from the factories and the farms on which they worked. So capitalism may have gotten rid of scarcity because now we have huge production. But there was one thing that it became increasingly scarce, and that is demand, aggregate demand, active demand for the goods that were being produced. And this is why the same production line, business model, that was generating all these goods and services was also generating crisis. It's called a realization crisis. This is what Marx called it. When you can produce things, but you can't produce the demand for those things. Now, why am I telling you all this? Because this is the foundation of the new imperialism. The new imperialism, when I say new, I'm talking about the 19th century and 20th century imperialisms, as juxtaposed against the slave-owning societies or the feudal societies' imperialisms, which were purely extractive, purely accumulative, purely, just brute force with which land and materials were being expropriated. Now you have a situation where the capitalist system uses imperialism for what purpose? To find demand abroad for the goods that are produced at home domestically, which, however, cannot be consumed domestically because of the low levels of demand. So if you want to understand, as I mentioned before, what happened with the Spaniards in Central America, that's pre-capitalist. You don't really need economics. You don't need political economy. It's simple to understand how the conquistadores managed to get on ships that were capable of taking them all the way to Central America, but their guns and the fact that they had gunpowder, whereas the Mayans and the Incas didn't. You don't need economics to understand how they looted all this gold and killed so many Mayans and so many Incas, right? But if you want to understand how the Japanese car industry destroyed the American car industry, if you want to understand, why the European Union today, especially Germany, is totally dependent on the United States, you've got to understand that both Japan in the 1960s, due to its rapid capitalist development, and Germany in the last 40, 50, 60 years, including today, their factories can produce a lot more stuff than the German workers, in the case of Germany, or the Japanese workers, in the case of Japan, can consume. So they need to export it. So there is a game that is being played for securing markets abroad. Now, I'll give you an example from my country. You may have heard that little Greece is part of the European Union. It's even part of the European Monetary Union. We share the euro. Now, we are a very low productivity country, low capital intensity country, a country that is full of deficits, and with very few things that we produce beyond olive oil and tourism and some oranges and agricultural goods. Yeah. So the question is, why did the Germans allow us to enter the European Union? Why did they want us to be part of this common market initially, back in 1980, 81? Well, the answer is because they needed our markets. We were customers. The German workers could not buy enough Volkswagens. The German market could not absorb enough Bosch and Siemens washing machines and refrigerators. So they needed us to become effectively their commercial colonies. So that's the point I'm making. I make the point that capitalism comes hand in hand with a need to expand its markets. And that explains the great wars of the late 19th century, the great wars of the 19th century, the colonization of Africa, the colonization of what was left of the Ottoman Empire, including your lands, after the First World War. This was all about creating markets and usurping markets and using markets for French industry, British industry, German industry, American industry, and so on. Now, let's move to the end of the Second World War in this rather, sort of overarching narrative that I'm subjecting you to. In 1944, 1945, the United States authorities were absolutely paralyzed by fear that the end of the Second World War would return the United States back to the Great Depression of 1929. You have to recall that between 1929 and 1933, when Roosevelt introduced his New Deal, the vast majority of Americans were suffering. They were suffering massively from this incongruity that I have presented to you, however briefly. The fact that the American economy was becoming increasingly productive in the 1910s, the 1920s, with Westinghouse, with Edison, with Ford, the mega corporation was being created. That gave rise to irrational exuberance in the 1920s, the roaring 20s. Debt was being used in order to propel the demand for the goods and the services until that debt blew up in 1929 with the collapse of Wall Street. And then after that, the factories were all closed. The workers are unemployed. Workers wanted to work. Employers wanted to employ them, but they just couldn't get it together. And it was the New Deal that tried to create the demand through what we would call Keynesian means, pump priming. The state creating the demand that the private sector couldn't. And that succeeded to some extent, the New Deal. But if it wasn't for the Second World War, and war is always a remarkable booster of demand, because the moment the Ministry of Defense, or War, starts ordering tanks and aircraft carriers and fighter jets and so on, the capitalist economy suddenly finds the demand that's been lacking, that it is fundamentally and profoundly and systematically lacking. So, to cut a long story short, I could say a lot more about the way in which the Bretton Woods system was designed in 1944, the way, what happened when it died in 1971. But I don't have time to do this now. But all I'm going to say is that there is a reason why the United States has a war every year. And the reason is the point I made just now, that an advanced capital-intensive capitalist economy lacks demand. And, either you're going to create the demand through socializing production, which is something that the bourgeoisie, the ruling class, will never allow, or you're going to find some other way of creating the demand. And the rough and ready manner in which that gap has been filled has been war. So the war in Korea, in Vietnam, later on in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Syria, in Libya. Essentially, the point I'm going to make is that victory was not the objective. Victory was good to have. They wanted to win their wars. But, people ask me, Yanis, how is it that the United States have really, in the end, not won a single war after the Second World War? Even the Korean War was not a success for the United States. The Vietnam War was an ignominious defeat. The Iraq wars. The first one was more or less okay for them because they stopped it early. Bush Sr. stopped it early. But the second one by Bush Jr., George W. Bush, was an unmitigated catastrophe. Millions died. Americans died. It was the main reason why Donald Trump was elected, because he promised that there wouldn't be another war like that. The war in Afghanistan. They spent 20 years replacing the Taliban with the Taliban. Lots of Americans died. Trillions were spent. But, okay, so I've heard colleagues of mine, friends of mine, my great friend Jeff Sachs, for instance, say, "Oh, what a terrible thing we've done, we Americans." I mean, because he's American, I'm not. Saying, "Oh, we wasted trillions instead of wasting of spending it on bridges and hospitals and stuff in the United States." Well, yes, but given that you have a capitalist system, which is a dictatorship of capital, of big capital, that's what capitalism is. There's no such thing as democracy, by the way. Anybody who thinks that the United States is democracy needs to rethink. It's an oligarchy with periodic elections that legitimize the oligarchy. The oligarchy would never, ever, ever, ever accept the only alternative to permanent war, and that is the socialization of the means of production to run the economy in the way that it was run during the Second World War, that is a war economy. During the war, the Second World War, under the Roosevelt administration, a gentleman called John Kenneth Galbraith, a very famous economist and a very nice man. I had the honor and the pleasure to have met him many decades ago. He essentially chose every price. The market mechanism was suspended. The American economy was running more or less like the Soviet economy. The only difference between the American economy in the 1940s during the war and the Soviet economy was that in America the factories were owned by privateers. They were not owned by the state. But what they produced, how much they produced, and what they charged was not decided by the entrepreneurs. It was decided by the state, by people like John Kenneth Galbraith. And the system worked brilliantly. It was, therefore, the great worry was of the New Dealers who were in power in the 1940s, late 40s, when the war was ending, was, my goodness, now that we're going to stop ordering aircraft carriers and tanks and, ammunition and fighter jets, not jets, at the time they didn't have them, fighter planes, where is the demand going to come from? The answer that was given to them was, well, look, we are going to convert our factories, instead of building fighter planes, we're going to build commercial planes. Instead of producing tanks, we will produce lorries. Instead of producing machine guns, we're going to produce washing machines. Yes, but the question was, where will the people of the United States find the money to buy all the washing machines that their gleaming factories could now produce? And the answer to that was, well, we are going to have to engineer the demand. And there were two ways in which they did it. One was to ensure that Germany, Japan, the rest of the world was functioning in a manner which was consistent with the interests of United States capital. That's new imperialism. For 15 years, 20 years, Europe and Asia became the sources of demand for American products. And America, CIA and so on, were overthrowing governments left, right, and center. The idea was that it was the Cold War against the Soviet Union, but even if the Soviet Union didn't exist, they would be doing exactly the same thing, because they wanted to guarantee two things for themselves, for the United States capitalist economy. One is sufficient aggregate demand, and the second thing was cheap energy. Why did they overthrow Mossadegh in 1953 in Tehran, in Iran? The only liberal democratic government, or the last liberal democratic government in Iran, for exactly that reason. Not only because they wanted the Iranian oil, but also because they wanted the Iranian market. Now, that brings me, because I need to start winding down in order to give you an opportunity to pose questions and we can have a discussion, to another great transformation, which I've been writing about over the last 7-8 years, because I think it is crucial. The next great transformation in the history of capital is what happened in the last decade with the emergence of big tech, of the Googles, the Microsofts, the Facebooks, the Ubers, the Airbnbs, and so on. Why is that significant? Capital is not money. Capital is defined in economics as produced means of production. That is, stuff that we produce in order to, not because we want it, but because we want to use it to produce something else. So a tractor. You don't produce a tractor because you want to go on a ride on it in town, okay? To go to the cafeteria on your tractor. You may do it, but that's not the way you could produce the tractor. You produce the tractor to produce wheat, to produce corn, to cultivate the land. Fishing rod, thousands of years ago. You create, you produce, you make a fishing rod to catch fish. And a steam engine. You create a steam engine in order to put it in textile factory to produce textiles. An industrial robot today, all singing, all dancing industrial robot that assembles cars. Again, that's a produced means of production. So capital has always been a produced means of production since time immemorial, where, thousands of years before capitalism. And that never changed until 10 years ago. Now we have something that lives inside, these machines of ours, our phones, our tablets, our computers, and so on, which is machine. It's a machine. It's a produced means of something. But it's not a produced means of production. Because, come to think of it, when you go into Google and you search something in the search engine, or you go to Facebook and you post something, that's not a commodity. It's a service. You may, really can't, we can't live without search engines where we go in there, put stuff. But search engines do not produce a commodity called search. A commodity, let me remind you, is something you produce in order to sell it. The Google search result comes free. You go into Facebook and you upload something. You go into Amazon.com and you post a review for a book. That's not a commodity. That's something that you just do. And why am I saying that this is a major transformation? And why should people in Palestine care about this new form of capital? That will be the last question that I answer here. The reason is because essentially the moment you move into a platform like Amazon.com or Alibaba or any of these, I'll stick to Amazon because it's the most successful such company, belongs to Jeff Bezos. Now, if you and I enter Amazon.com, we're sitting next to each other. You're here next to me, and you have your tablet, I have my tablet, and we go to Amazon.com and we write down, we punch the words coffee maker, because let's say my coffee maker is broken down, and I want a new one, and yours too. The recommendations, the 4 or 5 coffee makers that Amazon is going to point out to you as potential purchases, yours will be different from mine. Yours will be different from mine. Why? Because the machine knows you. We have trained those machines to train us, to train them, to know us better, to know what is the maximum price we're prepared to pay, so that Jeff Bezos, who doesn't make the coffee maker, some capitalist enterprise produces the coffee maker, will retain, you know how much Jeff Bezos retains every time you buy something on Amazon.com? 40%. 40%. That's not a profit, because he hasn't made it. This is a rent. It's a bit like the ground rent of the landlord under feudalism. So, something else. Amazon is not a market. There may be millions of buyers and millions of sellers, but it's not a market. Because in any market, there is a degree of decentralization. You can walk around and look at what's available. You can talk to other buyers, other customers like yourself. That's what you do in a marketplace. Not on Amazon.com. On Amazon.com, the algorithm doesn't let you talk to other people like you, unless you're sitting next to each other, which is very rare. And it doesn't let you peruse the different products that are on sale. It shows you the product it wants to show you, and it uses a statistical model in order to maximize the rent, I call it cloud rent, of somebody like Jeff Bezos. Now, why should we care about that? Why does this change our perspective on imperialism? This is how I'm going to answer this, and this is how I'm going to end. So prepare your questions and your interventions. Well, all these statistical models, these algorithms, need to be trained. Recently, I've said that before, it happened only recently, but I propagate that point. I was in Qatar last November, I believe, and I was sitting next to a gentleman that works for Palantir. Palantir is the company, you know it very well, in Palestine, that targets you, that decides whom amongst you to kill when the Israeli offense force, genocide force targets you. Now, I was sitting next to this guy from Palantir, and when I realized that he works for Palantir, I mean, I nearly jumped out of my skin. You can imagine that. But he was a very nice guy, and we talked, and I mentioned Gaza, and he said, "Oh, what's happening? What happened in Gaza over the last 2 years is fantastic for us." And I said, "Yeah, what? Tens of thousands of dead children is fantastic for you." He said, No, that's a terrible thing. But for us, it's fantastic. And then he explained to me, he showed me my phone, which was not doing anything. It was sitting just standing there, lying there on the table, on the dinner table. He said, "Your phone is useless to me now because it's not moving." But the phone that is moving is producing a lot of data, especially in a densely populated area where people are bombed. Because when people are bombed in a densely populated area, lots of phones start moving around. People, get killed. They run around. They pick up the phone to call their beloved ones to find if they're still alive, where they are they safe. That creates a lot of data. And we use this data to train our Amazon models, our health service models in places like they had just sold for £1 billion sterling to the British National Health Service, a publicly owned, a gem of old-fashioned social democracy. They had sold to them programs that helped British hospitals organize themselves and their nurses and doctors during times of emergency, and all that was trained using data from Gaza. So this new form of capital, to the extent that I'm right, that the owners of this new form of capital, because this new form of capital doesn't produce anything except the power to modify people's behavior, to make people do things. And my assertion in a book that I published 3 years ago called Techno-Feudalism is that, who owns these machines? Cloud capital, big tech in other words, owns our minds, owns a power to make us do things that no capitalist had before. No capitalist had before. And to the extent that these pieces of machinery, this cloud capital, is now trained in killing zones, in genocide zones, in Iran as we speak, in Ukraine, and so on, creates a new level of malice regarding imperialism. It's not just creating markets. It's not just selling weaponry. It's not simply selling missiles to people to kill other people with. That has always been part and parcel of imperialism, of war, of the arms trade. Now you have civilian software, civilian services that are being trained by the people as they're being killed. And that gives a whole new meaning to the word imperialism. Well, I think I've exhausted my 40 minutes plus 41 minutes. And I think that I've thrown enough at you to start having a conversation.
Yanis, thank you for this. Thanks a lot. I have some questions, but I want to see if people here have any comments or questions first.
Sure.
إذا في أي تساؤل أو أسئلة من الأشخاص الموجودين هون. ساري تفضل.
مرحبا. Hello, Dr.
يانس
Yanis.
اوكي الترجمة موجودة. تفضل ساري. There's
So, Dr.
translation
Yanis,
available.
thank you very much. I'm following your work and read your books, and I thank you for your time. I want to ask you, don't you also think there's a positive side to this AI and technology, and that there also, it's the danger, but yet it's the answer itself? If we manage to kind of decentralize it somehow, it might also lead us to new kind of economics, such as attention economy. Maybe we can apply UBI in certain areas. So don't you also think that we should also think about the positive side of AI, adaptation of technology, decentralization, cybersecurity, and also taking back this information and this data and owning it ourselves for the future? Thank you.
Thanks, Harry. Look, since you have been following my work, you must know the answer. I love technology. Technology is not the problem. Ever since we discovered the first tools. We had, as humans, as moral beings, we had the capacity to use them for good or for ill. The coming of the age of iron, for instance, it allowed us to plow the land better to produce more agricultural output, but it also allowed us to sharpen our tools of war and death and kill each other more efficiently. Every technological innovation can be used in order to create or in order to destroy, as a produced means of production or a produced means of destruction. So, of course. The problem, however, is that as long as these machines are owned by the 0.0001% of the human species, and their ownership is concentrated fully in two places, in Silicon Valley and in China. The rest of the world, we don't have any of that. We may be using it, but we don't control it. Now that, so the question is, how do we decentralize? Let me give you a very simple example to link it up to the idea of imperialism, which is what Basil asked me to talk about. Okay, remember when Donald Trump said he wants Greenland? Remember that? He wanted Greenland, and idiotic Western newspapers were beginning to write articles about, okay, is there a threat that maybe he will send the Marines in to take Greenland and so on. He didn't have to do that. Do you know how he could do it? He could threaten Denmark with a denial of service on the internet, because the United States can, if it wants, it can switch off your internet tomorrow morning. The international internet is dependent, except for the Chinese part, is dependent, at least in the West. Denmark will lose its internet within 5 seconds. John Deere tractors, Tesla cars, they're equipped with kill switches. They can just switch you off. So the question is not, are these machines useful? They're extremely useful. They're a testament to the ingenuity of the human mind. I mean, think about it. Now, there are algorithms. And by the way, don't buy the hype about AI. This was happening even before ChatGPT and all that. These are algorithms, the reinforcement learning algorithms. What ChatGPT does and DeepSeek and so does is very impressive, but it is a tiny little percentage of what I call cloud capital. Now, there are such algorithms that today are helping biologists and medical researchers design amazing antibiotics that can kill bacteria that are killing people. Now, that's fantastic. We need to celebrate that. You have to be a fool to say no to these machines. But do you know that exactly the same algorithms are being used by Amazon in order to predict which workers in the United States are going to strike and fires them before they do? So the question is not what can these machines do. The question is not what do these machines know about us. There's only one question. Who owns them? This is why I'm going to communicate this to you so that you know it and there is no misunderstanding between us. This is why I remain a Marxist. Because, just like Marx was saying that the problem with capitalism is not the machines. The machines are fantastic. The problem is not the factories. The factories are extremely useful. The problem is who owns them. What is the distribution of the ownership of property rights?
ثانكس يانس. في سؤال آخر أو طالي. مدر تفضل. مدر بس أنت ميوت. هلا.
Hi everybody. Yanis, allow me to take you back to the beginning of your speech today, and go back to the notion of what colonial expansion is about, and how capital benefits from this, and why is it necessary for capitalism. In Palestine, it's very much the mantra today and very much a la mode is to talk about settler colonialism, not colonialism. And I'm trying to think out loud here. And my thinking is that there is a sort of a small conspiracy sort of thing when we identify settler colonialism as if it's a completely different creature of a different origin than colonialism itself. as it's related to ethnic differences and not to class differences and struggles and so on and so forth. Your differentiation between profit and rent, I think, is very important because in the settler activity, you get more benefit in rent than in profit. It's land grabbing, and and it can explain why Israel, for example, wants to get rid of the local population instead of simply using them as cheap labor. They actually do both, as we know, but one of them becomes a bit more prominent or more acute in the lives of Palestinians because not only our labor power is taken away, but our ability to access resources is taken away through land grabbing and segregations and walls and what have you. And I noticed that the growth of Israeli settler activity happened mostly starting in the second half of the 70s. I mean, together with Thatcher, if you want, etc. And I would like to ask you to elaborate a little more about the revival of the role of rent versus profit in the neoliberal era, or even in the late neoliberal era, together with the transformations that took the system back to old colonial tactics and techniques like occupations, boot on the ground, war, etc., which were sort of basically revived from the old system because the new system was the tools that neoliberal capitalism became insufficient to maintain the existing order, and they were borrowing sort of something from the past. And probably we could make some sort of identification of the major boosting, whether it's land grabbing or the genocidal actions of getting rid of the people so as to grab the land, whether it's Netanyahu's or the Zionist dream or Trump's Riviera of the Middle East or what have you. But it's all about construction and about rent. How does this fit together with the cloud economy and the revival of the sort of rent versus profit in the late neoliberal era, let's say so?
Well, thank you. This is a fascinating question, and it brings out a dimension that I didn't have the time. I did have the interest, but not the time to go into. There's no doubt that Israel is a supremacist settler colonial exercise. There's no doubt about that. And to a large extent, that also explains the manner in which it is completely natural for America, for Germany, for France to feel as one with the Israeli settlers. Because, when the British arrived in Australia, for instance, they looked at a big, beautiful continent and they said, we want it. We want it. We want to extract all the resources, all the rents from it. And of course, there were 5-6 million natives there, and they decided they will call the land terra nullius. That is, a land without a people for a people without a land. That's where the slogan, the Zionist slogan, comes from. The Zionists were not even particularly inventive or innovative. They took it from the British terra nullius, which was, by the way, inscribed in the Australian Constitution from day one, in order to annul the rights of the natives, in order to effectively treat them like animals that can be shot on sight, which is what's happening in Palestine today, right? So that explains the very large. People say to me, "Oh, but how can the Europeans, with the great European values of the Enlightenment, support Israeli genocide and ethnic cleansing?" Well, because this is what they did. The Europeans invented the sport. They turned it into an Olympic sport, and but now I'm coming to the interesting part of your question, which is, where is the dividing line and what is the connection between expropriation and capitalist enterprise and profit making and surplus value extraction. Because that's how I take your question to be focusing. If you think about it in terms of the United States, take the United States, or even Australia, but let's take the United States. The settlers initially do nothing other than, grab the land, kill the natives, or push them out, put them into reservations like Gaza, right? And cultivate the land, and with very little labor from the natives in the United States. They had to import slaves from Africa in order to start producing surplus value. So for a while, it's pure expropriation, but that is not leading to capital accumulation. To have capital accumulation, you need to import proletariat. And the Americans imported the British, the Dutch, they imported a proletariat from Africa. And slowly, a homegrown white proletariat began to emerge. And then that's where the Crow laws were introduced in order to create a split between the white proletariats and the black proletariats, so the proletariat could be divided in order to be ruled over. And that success story is what propagated capital accumulation. Capital accumulation created huge bubbles of debt, because debt gets really overexcited when profits amass. Those debt bubbles broke, and then the United States had to go through spasms of imperialism in order to import demand. Now, a little aside before I finish my answer to your question. The one success story we had at ending apartheid was South Africa. In South Africa, however, the whites, the Boers, needed black labor. They couldn't do without black labor. Whereas in Israel, even though, as you said, they always used Palestinian labor, at some point, they decided they can do without. So you put the cutoff point, or the point at which things begin to change, and you may be right that the end of Bretton Woods, not so much Thatcherism. Thatcherism is a thing in the epiphenomenon. It is a repercussion of the transition of the world economy from the Bretton Woods era to the financialization era. Okay, so that I'm sure that you saw in Palestine, in Israel, you saw the effects of that. But I think the major effect was the collapse of the Soviet Union and the importation of a lot of laborers from the former Soviet Union, the Jewish migrants. I remember Israeli commentators saying that, well, we now don't need Palestinian labor, we have Slav labor. And I don't know, you know better than me whether that holds water or not. But, and here's my conclusion to your brilliant question, cloud capital is a new step for the development of the Israeli economy, because the tech industry in Israel managed to fuse itself completely with Silicon Valley. So Amazon, Microsoft, Meta, and so on, and now Palantir, of course, they wouldn't be able to function without Israel. All the training of these algorithms and so on happens in Israel. Palantir now has a capitalization twice that of Lockheed Martin that produces the F-35, and that's totally due to Israel, to the tech industry in Israel. So I think that what you do have in Palestine is a white settlement, a Jewish supremacist settlement project, just like you had in Australia under the British, just like you had in the United States, just like you had in Canada, just like you had in Namibia under the Germans, or in South Africa under the Boers. That is entirely intact. It's still going on. It's happening in the West Bank and so on. But on top of that, you have the layers of financialization and the layers of big tech that are adding to rent, either cloud rents or profits or financial rents.
Yanis, thanks. I know you have to run soon, but maybe we can take, if you don't mind, one or two more questions, quick questions.
Well, look, I can take all three. I can see three hands. I can take them only three and just answer them briefly.
That's perfect. Okay, so we'll start. سحر تفضلي.
Thank you very much for the interesting webinar. I just want to add one note regarding or something similarities what had been saying about the machine learning and the settler colonialism in Palestine. What Israeli doing is to control and own. And as they control the land, okay, they can have the positive effects, neither like just only having labor or having anything. The most and important objective to Israeli is to control land. And that's why in their policies, they even though do not give the ownership of the land in the names of the Israeli government, all the lands in their names. And they make leases to their population for around 99 years or 49 years because they don't want, even though their population, to control the land. Because who's control and on the land who can control everything and control the economic and control everything. That's the similarities between also the AI and the objectives of the settler colonialism in Palestine.
شكرا سحر. محمد مراغة.
مرحبا، بقدر احكي بالعربي؟
طبعا يعني you can switch to English channel if you'd like for the translation. محمد تفضل.
تحياتي لك يانس، واحنا من المتابعين لك. انا حقيقة سؤالي هو بتمحور حوالين منظورك لأزمة اليسار العالمي اكثر. زي ما بتعرف احنا بفلسطين، في اعتقادنا احنا بنواجه مشروع متقدم، قاعدة متقدمة للإمبريالية العالمية، وهذا بيستدعي كمان انه تحالفات أممية لمواجهة هذا المشروع. فبحب اسمع اكثر منظورك عن ازمة اليسار، بالتحديد اليسار الماركسي / لينيني الثوري في العالم. واخر تجربة كانت تجربة فنزويلا، فشل يعني واضح وصريح في هذه التجربة اللي كان في امال عليها كبيرة بنهاية التسعينيات بداية الألفية هاي، انها هي تكون نموذج لاشتراكية ال21 زي ما دعا لها هيوكو تشافيز. برأيك هل اليسار الماركسي اللينيني أكثر بتحول عماله ليسار ثقافي مجتمعي أكثر من أنه بيطمح للسيطرة أو الاستحواذ على السلطة لعمل تغييرات جذرية ضمن المفهوم اللينيني للتغييرات اللي ممكن تعملها أنت في الدول والمجتمعات؟ وليش في حالة التراجع الكبيرة لليسار بالتحديد في أمريكا اللاتينية وأكيد في مراكز معينة في أوروبا؟ شكرا.
شكرا محمد. ناخذ سؤال من سمير.
مساء
تفضل.
الخير للجميع. أشكر المتحدث أولا وأسلم على الحضور. سؤالي هو سؤال الأخلاق. أنا أعرف أن السياسة تقتات وتتغذى على المصلحة، وأن مادة الأخلاق ليست من مكونات السياسة. نحن لا ننظر إلى الغرب كوحدة واحدة من حيث مرجعية السياسات، وهنا أقصد أمريكا والاتحاد الأوروبي. بما يخص القضية الفلسطينية، من قرارات أممية وممارسات سياسية بالرجوع إلى ما يملكه الاتحاد الأوروبي من أدوات مثل المحكمة الدولية ومحكمة الجنايات وقرارات مجلس أمن وغيرها، وتأثير كل ذلك على انحصار أو تمادي السياسات الليبرالية. أنا شايف أنه يعني لقد تخلفت أوروبا عن دورها الأخلاقي تجاه القضية الفلسطينية، استنادا إلى دورها الأخلاقي والسياسي التي تعبر هي عنه. وأنا هنا أتكلم عن الجانب الرسمي وليس الشعبي الأوروبي. لماذا لم تبدأ معالم التغير في الاتحاد الأوروبي إلا بعدما رأت من سياسات ترامب تجاه العالم وتجاه الاتحاد، رغم تقاعس المستوى السياسي بشكل واضح جدا عن الإبادة في غزة أو تهويد الضفة؟ وإذا استوعب الاتحاد الأوروبي الدرس، كيف تتوقع أن يكون شكل التضامن، يعني التضامن المتوقع من الاتحاد الأوروبي القادم تجاه القضية الفلسطينية بناء على مسؤوليته الأخلاقية؟ شكرا.
طيب شكرا سمير. Yanis, I think a lot of questions. I just want to throw in just a quick final note from my side at least. And you don't have to answer it, of course, but do you think might we be able to witness a transformation or a potential kind of decline of these imperial forces or kind of conglomerate of forces that are violent and, of course, entrenched to these capital orders that you have described? Thanks a lot, Yanis.
Well, thank you. Okay, I'll start with Shahar. Thank you for the very important point you made about, which I didn't know, by the way. So you educated me. I didn't know that they're keeping the Israeli government's keeping the freehold and selling the leasehold to
Yes.
to settlers. This is really very interesting. Of course, this is again not innovative. This is what the royal family did in Britain. You know, 4/5 of London. You know, people who own houses there don't really own houses. They own leases to houses whose freehold belongs to some lord or duke. So, you know, the Israeli settlers are learning from the worst or the best, you know. So thank you for that. I take your point. It's a very important point. Mohammed, this is the source of much pain in my heart, the failures of the left. We are responsible for all the ills in the world. I'm speaking here as a committed leftist, as a committed socialist. The fascists would not have won if the left had done the right thing. And, you know, we have a very long tradition of doing the wrong thing. Whether we built, remember the Gulag was built by communists for communists. It wasn't built for the bourgeoisie, it wasn't built for the enemy. It was built in order to incarcerate, you know, comrades. I experienced that myself in 2015. I was briefly a minister. My enemy was not the Troika. My enemy was not the finance minister of Germany. He was my enemy, but he was doing his job. I was doing my job. We would have won, or at least we would have given them a good run for their money, if we didn't have the backstabbing from our own people. My own prime minister defected to the other side. You mentioned Venezuela. Venezuela is a very good example of how you can't replace a movement with an army. Because when the army takes over, whether it's the Venezuelan army, the Palestinian army, it doesn't matter, wherever the army takes over, in the end, the army generals, the army colonels become corrupt. And they use the army against the people. And so this is why there isn't that much of an uproar in Venezuela about the abducting of Maduro, even though the abducting of Maduro was a crime, international crime. There's no doubt about that. This is how it works. Speaking of national liberation struggle, we leftists have a duty to bring about unity, to bring about, to minimize the clashes between us, but we must always beware the fact that within our own nation, within our own tribe, within our own people, there are haves and have-nots. There are privileged people and underprivileged people. So as not to, you know, to say anything that will put you in trouble or me in trouble in Palestine, let me give you the Greek example. You know, we staged our national revolution, our liberation struggle in 1821. Okay. Now, who was the worst enemy of the Greek revolutionaries? Greek landowners, who didn't want the end of the Ottoman Empire because they were having it very well in the Ottoman Empire. It was only when they realized that the Greek rebels were going to win that they switched side and they became Greek patriots suddenly, right? And what did they try to do? They took over the government that they had opposed its creation of, right? In order to do what? To maintain their privileges, and they succeeded. You know, they were still under their reign here. So, you know, the worst traitors present themselves as patriots. And the difference is between left and right. Because what is the left supposed to be? It's all about, as I was saying before, ownership. You know, who owns what? And if the ones who lead the national liberation side are the ones who own almost everything themselves, you know, nothing good is going to come out of this national liberation side. Okay? We've seen this in Egypt. We've seen it everywhere. Samir, you're absolutely right. There's no such thing as Europe. There's no such thing as Germany. There's no such thing as Greece. There are many Europes. There are many Greeces. In Greece, as I said before, you know, the worst enemy of the people are the Greek oligarchs. Not the German industrialists, not the American imperialists. It's the Greek oligarchs who will do anything to sell out. In the United States itself, take the United States. Remember the 1960s, the anti-Vietnam protests? The ruling class of the United States were prepared to nuke their own cities to prevent their being toppled. You know, have no doubt, Washington, D.C. will bomb Portland, Minneapolis. You know, they will do to Minneapolis what they did to Gaza, if needs be. So, you know, the class struggle within our countries informs the national liberation struggle of all the people around the world. As for the European Union, look, during the 6 months I was finance minister, I saw the contempt with which the Greek people were being treated, as long as they said no. No to what? You must know, this is an important part of history that you should know. Because, you know, the Western press, the European press is presenting it as, oh, the Greeks wanted more money. They wanted more loans. No, we didn't. We wanted fewer loans. They wanted, I mean, I spent 6 months negotiating them, and they were trying to force more loans upon me. Why? Because those loans would then be used in order to repay them. They're bankers. And they were prepared, we were bankrupt. They wanted to lend us more to make us even more bankrupt in order to win time for their own banks. So they were prepared to see people die of hunger in the streets of Athens, okay, in order to save their ultra-rich bankers. Now, that's not European solidarity. That's not... If they treat us like that, imagine how they treat the Palestinians. Well, actually, no, I'll correct that. They treat us exactly the same. Exactly the same. Whether you're a Greek in, you know, working class in Europe, or you're a Palestinian in Kalkilia, a German banker sees you as raw material. That's what we are for them. And we need to understand that. So when I say to people, unless Palestine is free, we're not free, I mean it. This is not a poetic turn of phrase. And finally, Basil, do I see the decline in imperialism? Of course I do. Of course I do. Because you see, it's a very unnatural system. And anything that is unnatural can't survive for long. But the question is, will we be alive when it collapses? You know, John Maynard Keynes said something really very funny and correct once upon a time. Somebody said to him, Mr. Keynes, you claim that that the markets are stupid, they're irrational, they're doing stupid things. And so why don't you bet against them? And he said, well, because, you know, the markets can stay irrational longer than I can stay solvent. So similarly, what really matters is to minimize the human cost until imperialism collapses. Will it collapse next year? Will it collapse in 10 years? Will it collapse in 2 centuries? We don't know. We have to make sure that we minimize human suffering between now and then while bringing about its collapse.
Yanis, thanks a lot. There was another question on the US-China. I'm sure, I mean, maybe we ran out of time, but I just read it out loud because the person wrote it down. Maybe we'll end with that if you don't mind. Do you see an inevitable inflection point in history for direct conflict coming up between the US and China? Do you consider it an inter-imperialist battle or imperial versus socialist? So I guess it's just a question about, you know, the conflict between China and the US, whether it's inevitable or not. If you want to comment on that or not, Yanis, it's up to you. And
I'll comment on that, and then I'll go. Yeah. Look, China has already won. I mean, you see, the beauty from China's perspective is they don't have to do anything to win. They just need to watch the United States self-destruct. I mean, think of this Iran war now, right? I mean, what did the Chinese do? Nothing. They just made some very clever, very good comments that this is, you know, this war violates international law and shouldn't take place. And at the same time, they are demonstrating, they are the adults on the planet, they are demonstrating to people around the world that they are dependable. That when they put their signature somewhere, they mean it. And that, you know, they are not going to overthrow your government. And they're not going to kill you in your bed. And they let the United States dissolve all alliances, renege every agreement, kill people left, right, and center, including people in the United States. And, so China is winning. And it's not only winning, of course, because of that. I mean, this is the Jeff Sachs point that I made before. Whereas America is spending huge quantities of money on waging war in order to create the demand that is otherwise substandard, deficient in the United States. The Chinese don't do that. The Chinese invest in technologies. They invest in people. They invest in education. They have a very good education. They have a fantastic, extremely cheap education system. They have a fantastic hospital system. 10 years ago, their hospitals were horrible. They killed people. Today, Chinese hospitals are spick and span. They're efficient. They're cheap. They're humane. They work, right? Because they've invested in that. They have trains. 50,000 kilometers of super fast trains doing 300. The Americans cannot build a train from Boston to New York. They're incapable of building a train from Boston to New York. Now, the problem that China has is that it has its savings in dollars. They have $4.5 trillion in savings. So they don't really want America to collapse because it's as if you have all your money in a bank and then, that bank collapses. So they are slowly weaning themselves off the dollar system and they are bringing the rest of the BRICS Plus along with that. Now, is it a socialist country? Yes and no. Yeah, this is a beautiful dialectical part of China. The way I see China is a great source of hope for me. It's a country that works. It's a country that actually functions and makes progress. AI is used sensibly. In America, in Europe, we have everybody is working with Claude and with various AI bots that help you cheat your essays at university and write stupid poems in Shakespearean language, which is fun, but it is useless, really. I mean, do we need that? In Shenzhen, I saw, in Shanghai, I saw, drones that are AI equipped, that are used in farmlands, in agriculture, and they go above every little root, every little leaf of the plant, of vegetables, and they release just a few drops of water, tiny amounts of fertilizer, so that they don't poison the soil. And that's how they use AI, productively, to create good quality, organic, cheap vegetables. The Americans don't do that. They give you McDonald's to eat, to die of coronary, of a heart attack when you're 25, okay, to become obese, and to have ChatGPT write rubbish articles for you or essays for you. So, at the same time, there is a clash between the socialist segment of China and the capitalist segment of China. The Chinese Central Committee is like a huge cauldron in which you have representatives of the proletariat, you have representatives of finance, you have representatives of big tech, you have representatives of agricultural workers. And, the clashes within the Central Committee of the Communist Party in China are far more interesting than the clashes in our parliaments. There's far more genuine debate between them. Municipalities are fully democratic in a way that doesn't happen in Europe at the level of municipality, as long as you don't say anything bad about Xi Jinping, all right? So this is why I say that China is a source of hope and work in progress. We don't know how it's going to turn out, but so far, so good for them.
Okay. Great. Thanks, Yanis. Thanks a lot for your time and for this conversation. Hopefully we'll be able to meet you here in Palestine. Thanks once again for your time, and I thank the audience for being here. شكرا للجميع ويعطيكم الف عافية وشكرا
شكرا لك. Thank you, Yanis. Thank you.
Ευχαριστώ, με καλές γιορτές.
Ευχαριστώ. Thank you, folks.
يعطيكم العافية. شكرا يانس. Thank you so much.
Freedom to Palestine.
Thank you.
Freedom to Palestine. Thank you.